The spotlight hit Whitney Houston's face on February 9th, 2012, and something was different. The 50,000 fans packed into the Staples Center couldn't quite name it yet, but they felt it in their bones. This was supposed to be just another triumphant Whitney concert, another night of vocal magnificence, and that voice that had redefined what R&B could be. But when the band struck the opening chords of I Will Always Love You, the song Whitney had made legendary at every concert for over 2 decades, she stood frozen at the microphone. Her lips didn't move. Her hands trembled at her sides. And then, in front of thousands of witnesses, the greatest voice in music history did something no one had ever seen her do. She walked off stage in the middle of a song, leaving nothing behind but confusion, a silent microphone, and a mystery that would haunt everyone who was there that night. What happened in those final moments wasn't just a performer having a bad night. It was a woman confronting the unbearable weight of losing the one thing that defined her entire existence. If you want to discover more untold stories behind music's greatest legends, subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you the real memories, the forgotten encounters, and the truths that change music history forever. Let us know in the comments what other artists you'd like us to cover. Los Angeles in mid-February carried the electric anticipation that only a Whitney Houston concert could generate. Whitney had performed in this very venue before, commanding the stage like the vocal empress she'd always been meant to be. But this night felt different from the moment her limousine pulled up to the venue that afternoon. The winter air was crisp with excitement as thousands of fans began streaming into the Staples Center. Many wearing vintage Whitney t-shirts and carrying signs declaring their love for the voice. But inside the venue, away from the fan hysteria, a different kind of tension was building. BB Winans noticed it immediately when Whitney emerged from her dressing room for the sound check. The woman who had once soared across stages with the confidence of an angel now moved like she was carrying invisible chains. Her trademark powerful gestures seemed forced, mechanical, as if she was consciously remembering to be Whitney Houston rather than naturally inhabiting the role. BB had seen this progression over recent months, particularly during their recording sessions for what was supposed to be her comeback album. Whitney's perfectionism, always intense, had become almost obsessive. She would record vocal takes dozens of times, never satisfied, always pushing for something that seemed just beyond her reach. The other musicians had attributed it to artistic growth, to Whitney's evolution as a vocalist. But now BB wondered if something deeper had been driving that relentless pursuit of perfection. Alicia Keys, who was scheduled to perform with Whitney that night, had noticed changes too, though she'd kept her observations to herself. During rehearsals, Whitney would sometimes lose her place in songs she'd performed thousands of times. She'd cover these lapses with her natural charisma, turning mistakes into moments of audience interaction. But Alicia could see the fear in her eyes when it happened. The fear that her legendary voice, her supernatural ability to command any stage, might be failing her. Ricky Minor, her musical director, as always the most observant member of the team, had seen Whitney's hands trembling during their pre-show meeting. Not the excited energy that usually preceded a major concert, but something that looked suspiciously like panic. Whitney Houston didn't get stage fright. She never had. The stage was where she felt most at home, most herself, most alive. But today, something beyond physical exhaustion shadowed Whitney's eyes. It was the look of a woman who had received news that changed everything. The test results from her private physician, Dr. Christina Rodriguez, had arrived 3 weeks earlier on a Thursday morning that had started like any other. Whitney had been at her New Jersey home, working in her garden when the phone rang. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but those 5 minutes had shattered her understanding of her future. The words irreversible vocal damage had transformed Whitney's entire understanding of everything. Her relationships, her career, her identity, her responsibility to the people she loved. In 2012, for a singer whose voice was considered one of the greatest natural gifts in music history, this diagnosis was essentially a death sentence wrapped in medical terminology. There were no treatments that could restore what had been lost, no hope for recovery, only the grim reality of progressive deterioration. But she told no one. Not Alicia, with whom she'd been planning this comeback tour. Not BB, who'd been her spiritual anchor for decades. Not even Bobby Christina, her beloved daughter who'd inherited her musical gifts. Not Patricia Houston, her sister-in-law and manager who'd been trying to help her rebuild her career. The secrecy wasn't just about protecting herself from pity or changing dynamics within her team. It was about protecting her legacy itself, the voice that had become bigger than any individual career. In 2012, admission of vocal failure could destroy everything Whitney had worked for, could turn a triumphant comeback into a tragic farewell. Whitney knew that her diagnosis could potentially destroy everything she'd built, but that wasn't the only secret weighing on her that crisp February afternoon. The more devastating burden, the weight that made her chest tight and her breathing shallow, was what this diagnosis meant for her daughter, Bobby Christina, the young woman who'd inherited Whitney's gift and was just beginning her own musical journey. Bobby Christina, who'd grown up in recording studios, who'd been singing harmony with her mother since she could talk. Bobby Christina, who was supposed to carry on the Houston musical legacy, who looked to Whitney not just as a mother, but as the blueprint for what a gifted vocalist could become. Every night when Whitney sang "I Will Always Love You," she was singing to her daughter's future. Every night she was publicly declaring a love that had become complicated by fear, by illness, by the knowledge that everything she'd promised about the power of voice and music had been built on foundations that were crumbling beneath her feet. The doctors had explained the progression, the inevitability of what was happening to her vocal cords, the way years of strain and substance abuse had damaged the instrument that had made her legendary. But Whitney couldn't bring herself to explain to Bobby Christina that the voice she'd inherited might be cursed rather than blessed, that the gift they shared might ultimately destroy them both. The guilt was consuming her from the inside, making every public performance feel like a betrayal of the most profound kind. But you haven't heard the most heartbreaking part yet. The afternoon hours before the show unfolded with mechanical precision. Wardrobe assistants laid out the elegant black gown that had become Whitney's signature look for ballads. Sound engineers ran checks while Alicia Keys went through the set list one more time. But there was one song that always remained constant. "I Will Always Love You" came near the end of every show. A moment when Whitney would transform 50,000 strangers into intimate confidants, sharing the most powerful love song ever recorded. What those closest to Whitney didn't know was that she'd woken that morning thinking about Bobby Christina. Not as she was now, but as the 5-year-old girl who'd first heard her mother sing this song and declared that someday she wanted to make people cry with her voice too. Whitney had claimed "I Will Always Love You" as her own in 1992, trying to capture in melody what she couldn't express about unconditional love, about protection, about the fierce devotion of a mother for her child. When she'd first performed it for Bobby Christina, the little girl had cried, understanding somehow that this was Whitney's way of saying she would love her no matter what happened. Now, 20 years later, with her voice carrying damage that was slowly destroying her ability to reach those legendary high notes, every time Whitney sang those words on stage, she felt like she was betraying Bobby Christina all over again. She was modeling a career path that had ultimately led to destruction, encouraging dreams that might become nightmares. At 8:30, the house lights dimmed and the crowd erupted. The opening strains of "I Wanna Dance with Somebody" filled the Staples Center, and for a moment, the magic worked. Whitney emerged onto the stage like a conquering queen, arms spread wide, accepting the adoration like oxygen. The performance machine kicked into gear. "How Will I Know" brought the crowd to their feet. "I Have Nothing" showcased the gospel-influenced vocals that set Whitney apart from every other R&B singer. But Ricky Minor kept noticing something off in Whitney's voice. The power seemed forced, like watching a great athlete trying too hard to recapture past glory. The set list progressed through familiar territory. "Run to You" brought aggressive edge. "Where Do Broken Hearts Go" proved she was unlike anything that had come before. Between songs, Whitney bantered with the audience, her natural charisma still capable of making 50,000 people feel like she was talking directly to each of them. But as the show approached its final act, as the orchestra prepared for the evening's emotional climax, something shifted in Whitney's demeanor. Ricky Minor watched as the color drained from the singer's face. "I Will Always Love You" was always the transcendent moment, the place where the pop star became pure emotion. As Whitney walked to center stage, the band prepared for the familiar ritual. The introduction began, those gentle piano chords that every person in the Staples Center could probably hum in their sleep. The audience settled into warm anticipation of being serenaded by one of the greatest voices in music history. The orchestra played the introduction perfectly, and 50,000 people waited for the opening line. That's exactly when everything fell apart. Wait until you hear what happened next. As the introduction repeated, as the band looked over, expecting Whitney to begin singing, something unprecedented happened. Whitney didn't sing. She stood at center stage, microphone in hand, and she remained completely silent. At first, the audience thought maybe she was creating dramatic tension, building anticipation for that legendary voice. But those close enough to see her face clearly saw something that made their stomachs tighten. Her eyes were closed, her jaw was clenched, and tears were sliding down her cheeks, cutting through the stage makeup and revealing the exhausted woman beneath the carefully constructed persona. Alicia Keys moved closer from her position at the piano, concerned. Ricky Minor stopped the subtle orchestral accompaniment, and 50,000 people began to realize that something was seriously wrong. Whitney opened her eyes, and anyone close enough to see her expression would never forget what they witnessed. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't stage fright. It was pure, undiluted grief. She looked out at the ocean of faces. All these people who loved Whitney Houston but had no idea who Whitney Elizabeth Houston really was. And she seemed to be apologizing for something they couldn't understand. She raised the microphone to her lips, opened her mouth, and no sound came out. Not because she was choosing silence, but because her voice, that legendary instrument that had sold over 200 million records, simply wasn't there anymore. Then, without a word, without explanation, she placed the microphone on the stage and walked off. The silence that followed was deafening. You're not ready for what happened backstage. Alicia Keys was the first to reach Whitney behind the stage barriers. What she found would stay with her for the rest of her life. Whitney had collapsed against a concrete wall, still in her elegant gown, but looking nothing like the commanding presence who'd owned the Staples Center just minutes before. She was sobbing, deep-wrenching cries that come from somewhere beyond grief, beyond exhaustion. Her hands covered her face, and between the sobs, she kept repeating words that made no sense to Alicia at first. I can't lie to them anymore. I can't do it. Not about the voice. Not anymore. Pat Houston, Whitney's manager and sister-in-law, arrived within seconds along with Dr. Rodriguez. But Whitney waved them all away with a gesture that communicated absolute finality. The show was over. Not just this song, not just this concert, but something much bigger. B.B. Winans found his way backstage, still carrying his gospel hymnal. Whitney, what's happening? Are you in pain? But Whitney just shook her head, tears still flowing freely. For the first time in perhaps years, Whitney Houston was allowing people to see her completely vulnerable, completely human, completely broken. The arena management faced an impossible situation. Pat Houston appeared on stage to address the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, Whitney isn't feeling well this evening. We thank you for a wonderful night and apologize that the show must end here. But backstage, something unprecedented was happening. Whitney Houston was finally telling the truth. Here's what makes this confession particularly devastating. She talked to Alicia, BB, Ricky, and the small circle of people she trusted most. She talked about how "I Will Always Love You" had become impossible to perform because every night it reminded her of promises she'd made to Bobby Christina about the power of voice and music, promises she'd been incapable of keeping. She talked about how the song had become a nightly confession of her own failure as both an artist and a mother. But here's what makes this confession particularly devastating. Whitney talked about Bobby Christina not with bitterness or regret, but with a love so pure and complicated that it broke everyone listening. She explained that her daughter had been the only person who'd ever heard Whitney Elizabeth Houston sing and loved her for the voice itself, not for the fame or success it brought. She believed in the gift, Whitney whispered. She believed that God gave us these voices to heal people, to bring joy. But look what I've done with it. Look what it's cost. Alicia was the first to speak. Whitney, your voice has touched millions of lives. You've given people hope, love, inspiration. But Whitney stopped her with a look that communicated acceptance rather than despair. "Alicia, darling, I'm not afraid of losing my career. I'm afraid of what I've taught my daughter to want. I'm afraid I've shown her that this gift is worth destroying yourself for." Whitney explained that "I Will Always Love You" had been claimed during the happiest period of her career, when she genuinely believed her voice could transcend any obstacle, could heal any wound, could love anyone back to wholeness. The song captured her hope that music could conquer everything. But as her career evolved, as the pressures of fame and the demands of maintaining that legendary voice had led to choices that damaged both her health and her relationships, the song's meaning had changed. It became an apology, a memorial to what she'd lost in pursuit of vocal perfection. The voice damage had poisoned even that comfort. Now every time she tried to sing about love, her failing voice reminded her that she'd taught Bobby Christina to chase something that might ultimately destroy her too. "How long have you known?" Alicia asked quietly. "3 weeks," Whitney answered simply. 3 weeks of trying to pretend nothing had changed. 3 weeks of getting on stage and singing about love when all I could think about was failure. The confession continued, revealing layers of Whitney's internal struggle that none of them had suspected. She talked about the loneliness of being the voice, about how being Whitney Houston had sometimes felt like wearing a costume that never came off. She talked about her fear that Bobby Christina would repeat her mistakes, would sacrifice her happiness for vocal achievement. But mostly she talked about her daughter and how she'd represented the possibility of redemption, of using the gift correctly. The song had been her way of promising Bobby Christina that love would always be stronger than any obstacle. "You won't believe what she said next." Ricky Minor finally spoke. "What do you need from us, Whitney?" And Whitney's answer revealed everything about her character. "I need you to help me figure out how to be honest without destroying her dreams. I need to find a way to show Bobby Christina that the gift is beautiful, but the industry that uses it can be poison." The conversation that followed changed everything about Whitney's future. They talked about how to handle the press, how to protect Whitney's privacy while being authentic about her struggle, how to continue nurturing Bobby Christina's talent while warning her about the costs. The audience that night never got an explanation beyond Pat Houston's brief announcement. They filed out confused and concerned. But for the team members, February 9th, 2012 became a dividing line between before and after. Bobby Christina learned about the concert incident from a phone call from Alicia Keys the following day. The conversation between Whitney and her daughter that evening has never been publicly detailed, but those who saw them together afterward described a moment of complete honesty between a mother and daughter who finally understood each other's fears. Despite the pain, the impact of that night extended far beyond personal relationships into Whitney's final artistic choices. She became more intentional about her remaining performances, more focused on creating moments that would guide Bobby Christina rather than impress audiences. Whitney never performed "I Will Always Love You" publicly again. When she sang it privately for Bobby Christina in their final weeks together, it carried different energy, different intention. Instead of trying to recreate the hope and promise of the original, she performed it as a blessing, a protection spell, a way of saying that love could survive even when voices failed. But here's the most incredible part of this story. When Whitney died just 2 days later on February 11th, 2012, the last song on her phone's voice memo was a quiet, imperfect recording of "I Will Always Love You," with a spoken message to Bobby Christina. "Baby girl, your voice is your gift, but your heart is your treasure. Don't let anyone convince you to trade one for the other. I will always love you, no matter how high or low you sing." The fan response when details finally emerged was overwhelmingly supportive. Learning that Whitney had struggled with impossible choices between honesty and performance only deepened their appreciation for her artistry and her humanity. Bobby Christina eventually pursued music, but with a different understanding of what the gift meant. She built a career focused on healing and connection rather than technical perfection. Their relationship had evolved into something unique, a love that transcended professional categories. Today, when tribute artists perform "I Will Always Love You," it carries the weight of that night at the Staples Center. The understanding that some songs become more powerful when they're broken and rebuilt, when they're informed by truth rather than just technical ability. The 50,000 people who were at the Staples Center that night witnessed something unprecedented. The moment when a legend chose truth over entertainment, when vulnerability became more important than invincibility, when love proved more complex than any song could contain. February 9th, 2012 was the night Whitney Houston stopped pretending and started preparing for goodbye. Everything that came after was informed by that choice to be honest about the impossibility of singing about eternal love when your voice was dying and your greatest fear was passing that burden to your child. That's the real story of the night Whitney couldn't sing "I Will Always Love You." Not a failure of voice or technique, but a triumph of honesty over pretense, of humanity over mythology, of love over the lies we tell to protect the people we care about most. If this incredible story of courage and truth moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about the power of choosing honesty over perfection. What's your favorite Whitney Houston memory? Let me know in the comments below.